This is part 2 of the Router Table Circle Cutting Jig series of videos. In the first video I showed you how to make this jig, which enables you to cut circles on the router table by drilling a hole in the piece of wood you're working with and then using the pivot pin on the jig to cut the circle. In this video I'm going to show you how to adapt this jig so that you can continue to cut circles on the router table but without having to drill the hole through the piece that you're working with. Sometimes having that hole in the middle doesn't really matter, but other times it's going to be really unsightly. So having a jig that can do both is really useful. Let's get on with the build. I started by taking the carriage out of the jig and dismantling it. I marked out a spot in the centre for the pivot hole. I then drilled out the hole. Unfortunately, while test fitting the nail, I managed to snap the carriage in half. So I made a new one and re-drilled the holes, this time drilling them at 3mm to help prevent the pin from splitting the wood again. I cut another nail down to size for the pivot plate. The pivot plate itself is made from 4mm thick beech. I used the same thickness piece for the standoff on the end of the jig. I marked out a centre point on the pivot plate and then glued the standoff piece into position with hot glue. I could then drill out and countersink the hole in the pivot plate. The standoff was then trimmed down on the router table with a flush trim bit. I drilled and countersunk 2 holes in the standoff plate so that it could be easily attached and removed with a couple of short screws. The pivot pin was then glued into place. I trimmed the excess glue off with a chisel to make sure that the plate sits flush with the carriage on the jig. I used hot glue to attach the pivot plate to the test piece of MDF that I was using for this demo. If this was for an actual project, I would advise using double-sided tape, as the hot glue will tear off the MDF coating. Hot glue will be fine for most other wood though. I then used the jig as a rough compass to trace the outline of the circle. I then cut away the excess on the bandsaw. I started cutting the circle, and it was at this point that I realised the router bit was really dull, so it was a bit more work than I had envisaged, but a sharper bit would resolve this. And that's the jig finished. We can now cut circles on the router table with or without a hole in the piece we're working with. And to change the jig between the two functions, it's as easy as removing the carriage and flipping it over, adding or removing the standoff, then if we're using a hole in the piece, using the pivot pin on the carriage, otherwise we can glue a pivot pin onto the piece. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you found this useful, then please subscribe. It'd be great to have you along for future videos. Take it easy.